I went to Washington for college. I arrived 2 weeks before September 11th, 2001. On that morning, I sat in Intro to Microeconomics, an 8 a.m. class. My professor started the lecture by saying a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I and others thought he meant something like a Cessna, a small plane. When I left class 90 minutes later, the world had changed. People were literally walking home from DC, and I could see the smoke rising from the Pentagon. That day and the days that followed led me to pursue a career in public service. For the past 2 years, I've worked as a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development, America's lead foreign assistance agency. That job was the privilege of a lifetime and something that I had long worked toward. But 118 days ago, both my position and our country's relationship with the rest of the world was upended by the Trump administration. Tonight, I want to tell the story of what happened since January 20th to USAID and place that in the context of the broader forces seeking to reshape American life. But before I do that, I want to share the history of foreign aid and how the American people have understood that. US foreign aid rebuilt post-World War II Europe. It rebuilt Japan. It launched the Asian tigers on their path to explosive economic growth. In partnership with philanthropy, it funded the Green Revolution that increased crop yields and reduced hunger and poverty in South Asia. Foreign aid has saved countless lives from HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other tropical diseases. It's supported countries like Ukraine in their struggles for self-determination, and it enabled the democratic market transitions in the former Eastern Bloc countries after the Cold War. But why does the United States provide foreign aid? The reasons are complicated, so for our purposes today, let's agree to call it enlightened self-interest. The United States is a wealthy country, and foreign aid does appeal to a deep moral belief that we should help lift others up. But it's also a strategic imperative. The Marshall Plan provided European governments with loans that were then used to buy American agricultural products and other goods, and that helped spur our own post-war economic expansion. It also influenced the electorates in France and Italy that helped prevent communist parties from winning elections. The Kennedy administration created USAID through the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. Since the Marshall Plan, foreign aid programs had proliferated. There was tremendous bipartisan support to make foreign aid more effective and efficient by housing all of those efforts in one agency. Now, I'm a good son of Massachusetts, so I'm partial to JFK. And his message to Congress requesting this legislation, I believe he and his administration captured the essence of why the United States, in the modern era, needed foreign aid. And it's a message that still resonates. Let me read a brief excerpt. Our moral obligations as a wise leader and good neighbor in the interdependent community of free nations are economic obligations as the wealthiest people in a world of largely poor people. As a nation no longer dependent upon the loans from abroad that once helped us develop our own economy, and our political obligations as the single largest counter to the adversaries of freedom. To fail to meet those obligations now would be disastrous and, in the long run, more expensive. For widespread poverty and chaos lead to a collapse of existing political and social structures, which would inevitably invite the advance of totalitarianism into every weak and unstable area. Thus, our own security would be endangered and our prosperity imperiled. A program of assistance to the underdeveloped nations must continue because the nation's interest and the cause of political freedom require it. Moral obligations, a good neighbor, weak and unstable areas, our own security at risk. But the American people have always had complicated feelings about foreign aid. Polling suggests that the majority of Americans do think we should provide aid, but they want to see a clear benefit for that aid in return. When asked how much the government spends on foreign aid, the majority of Americans believe that over 25% of the federal budget is foreign aid. If only we had that much money. When asked how much we should spend, most Americans believe it should be 10% of the federal budget. The reality is we spend around 1% of the federal budget each year on foreign aid. In a good year, that's around $40 billion. Despite this public support, there has always been a subset, largely on the right, who viewed foreign aid as a giveaway that benefited the wrong people, or worse, simply disappeared into the pockets of corrupt leaders and bureaucrats. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio famously called it money down a foreign rat hole during a congressional debate in the late 1940s. Today, disinformation and misinformation spreads far more quickly, and it's clear that between Election Day in November and the inauguration in January, there were voices on the right, largely in social media, who were feeding a warped image of what USAID is and what it does. Now, I'm sure many here know who Joe Rogan is. Some of you have probably listened to his podcast. I confess that until recently, I never had. But Rogan recently hosted a man named Mike Benz, a former State Department official who now runs an organization dedicated to freedom of expression. I'll be kind, but he's really a professional conspiracy theorist. Benz weaves a story of how the US government supports propaganda, political warfare, coups, and efforts to achieve its goals through non-military means. He talks about national security findings and memos that were drafted in the 1940s and 50s, the role of the CIA, and coups in Iran and Guatemala. He soon pulls in USAID, only created in 1961, and by the end of his story, USAID and the CIA are nearly indistinguishable from one another. In Benz's telling, long-time US support for press freedom, political party strengthening, good governance, and minority right is really an offshoot of the CIA's past efforts to overthrow leaders and governments we opposed. US support for the color revolutions that brought pro-democracy movements to power in Ukraine, Georgia, and other former Soviet states in the mid-2000s were actually nefarious plots to install friendly regimes largely orchestrated by USAID. Now, when I tell the story, it sounds ludicrous. But in an era of do-your-own research, and with the reach that Rogan and now X has under Musk, Elon Musk's leadership, these ideas reach an ever-expanding number of people. The New York Times recently showed that after false claims were made by Benz and others about USAID, negative posts about it exploded on X. Many posts were from accounts that Musk and other right-wing influencers followed and then further amplified. But Rogan and Benz, even with X's elevation of their ideas, were not enough. Conservatives have long held the belief that the federal government is too big. And as I said, many have disliked foreign aid. The first Trump administration, for its part, sought to cut the foreign aid budget annually by over 30%. Congress, however, pushed back and never enacted those cuts, exercising its power of the purse. Entered the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, and by the way, that is their real graphic that they use, Russell Vought, and Pete Morocco. The actions of DOGE and these individuals, combined with Benz's narrative and the social media platforms they're on, created a perfect storm for what happened to USAID. Now, I assume DOGE needs no introduction, so let's talk about Russ and Pete. Russ Vought is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and he's a longtime conservative policy voice who's worked at the Heritage Foundation and other right-leaning think tanks. He's also nurtured the idea that the non-political bureaucracy is in fact an enemy of his brand of conservatism. Famously, he said that it's his dream to make conditions so unbearable for bureaucrats that they would hate coming to the office. He was also an architect of Heritage's Project 2025, and now, as the OMB director, he's playing an outsized role in reshaping the federal bureaucracy. Until he was fired 2 weeks ago, Pete Morocco was the director of foreign assistance at the State Department. Morocco served in the first Trump administration in 4 different agencies and 4 different jobs. Now that's quite the record because it wasn't for good performance. As F director, as the position is known internally, Morocco would serve as the hatchet man for Vought and DOGE. Fueled by a perception that the bureaucracy had wronged him in the past, Morocco took to this role with gusto. It's clear now that there was a plan to systematically dismantle USAID and in the process make permanent reductions in the size of the foreign aid budget. Trump began the assault by signing 2 day-one executive orders that dealt directly with foreign aid. One, an immediate pause on any new foreign aid spending, and the second, ordering a 90-day review of existing foreign aid programs administered by the State Department and USAID. Within a week of that, the administration then placed 58 senior career staff from aid on administrative leave. That amounted to a decapitation strike of our leadership. DOGE arrives soon after that physically in the office and immediately demanded access to internal systems, including USAID's financial and payment systems. In late January, DOGE further asked for more access to more sensitive information, and aid actually initially refused this request, and it triggered a standoff that ultimately included armed U.S. Marshals. Following this, USAID staff were told to no longer report to the office, and our access was actually physically barred by armed guards. Finally, in mid-February, Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that 83% of USAID's contracts and grants would be terminated, and the remaining projects would be merged into the State Department. Nearly all of USAID's 10,000 staff would be terminated, and at best, 300 would join the State Department to manage the remaining foreign aid programs. We're still waiting on that 90-day review, and I wouldn't hold your breath. It took less than 2 months for this administration to shut down an agency that had stood for 64 years. Ultimately, USAID was a test run for DOGE and the Trump administration. The playbook they used there has now played out at multiple agencies and departments. It stands in marked contrast to the approach the Trump administration took the first time, where they simply sought to cut the foreign aid budget. Instead, this time they have focused on administrative action, terminating contracts, freezing spending, reducing staff through quasi-legal means, and pursuing a so-called reorganization. Congress has far more limited ability to influence these actions, and despite long-standing bipartisan support for USAID and foreign aid, the administration has chosen its words very carefully. It cast USAID as a rogue agency that was central to the Biden administration's spreading of a radical woke agenda around the globe. For a Republican Party that was primed for a culture war, this language muted potential pushback and silenced many long-standing supporters of foreign aid, such as Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and now Secretary Rubio. For those of us who care about U.S. engagement in the world, the next 4 years will be tough. The actions to eliminate USAID and reduce foreign aid means that the United States is far less able to support the next generation of partners and allies. Our foreign and trade policy, which targets close allies as well as our strategic competitors, will only make our country weaker still. I should say that no one who worked at USAID on January 20th, 2025 believed that the agency or U.S. foreign assistance more broadly worked perfectly. Most, if not all, believed that things could be done more efficiently and more effectively, that too much of our foreign aid was spent on overhead to contractors or NGOs, and that we needed to better prioritize where we worked and what we worked on. Looking ahead, much work will need to be done. My hope is that in 4 years' time, those of us who remain committed to a positive vision of American global engagement will be able to rebuild. I want this to be a lemonade out of lemons moment. We need to work to ensure that the good achieved by USAID, and indeed the United States as a whole, is not wasted. Polling shows that Americans still believe the United States should play a positive global role. They certainly want to understand what we get from this, so we do need to better explain what the value proposition is. We have a deep hole to dig out from, but we can do it because we must do it. As recent history shows, problems overseas, pandemics, conflict, famine, can easily show up here or snowball into something bigger. Public service and foreign aid are critical to confronting these challenges, and I urge all of us to continue to see them as worthwhile. Thank you.